In this video, we're going to begin our instruction for circle graphs. So let's read the directions. It says, look at each circle graph and the percents if necessary and subtract from 100 to find the missing percent. So because percents are based on parts of 100, there can be several different percents in the same 100. However, all the percents must add up to 100. If one of the percents is unknown, add the known percents and subtract the sum from 100 to find the missing percent. So in a circle graph, it is a 100% circle. So we know the percents are out of 100. So we can look at the pieces that we know and subtract from 100 to find the pieces that we don't know. So if you look at the example that was done here for example A, it says, what is the missing percent? Well, we know there's 20, 40, and 30. And we know total they should be 100. So if we add together 20 plus 40 plus 30, we get 90. And then 100% minus 90% gives us 10% for the missing percentage that's there. So let's do number one together. What is the missing percent? So if I know there's 75% total, if I do 100 minus 75, that's going to equal 25%. So that's the answer that goes here. Now many of you might be able to see that this is 3/4. So if you take your pie and you cut it into fourths, this is 3/4. So the last fourth is 25%. So you may have that memorized. If not, you can just take what you know, the 75, subtract it from 100, and you're left with that 25%. So let's look at number 2. What is the missing percent? I want you to figure out what is the answer for number 2. So if we take 100 minus the 60 that we know, we are left with 40%. And that's going to be the answer. Now, what do we do whenever we have more than one pie slice? We're going to add those two together. So we have 30 plus 50 is 80%. And then we'll take 100, because that's the total, minus the 80% that we know, and we're left with 20%. So go ahead, you try number 4 on your own. So for number 4, we have 10 plus 40 equals 50%. And then we have 100 minus the 50% that we know, and we're left with 50%. Now you may not have had to do any math for this one. You could have just maybe looked at the circle and said, well, I know that's half of the pie, so I automatically know that that's 50%. That's perfectly fine too. So if you have those memorized, use that to your advantage. So let's look at the next page. So it says circle graphs can be used to represent ratios because they show the relationship between a part and a whole. So we're going to use ratios or fractions or whatever other term you want to use for that piece where you're using that fraction bar. And we're going to use that to help us understand our circle graphs. So using what we did on the first page, let's use it here. So it says the shaded section of the circle graph represents 100%, or the fraction 1 over 1. So I'm using the little line right here as my fraction bar. Because if you do 1 divided by 1, that would give you a whole 100%. Now, the shaded part, the shaded section of the circle graph represents, and I'm talking about this shaded section right here. That would be half of the circle. You could say 1/2 is the fraction. Or you could also say it's 50%. Now, if you want to do the math, 1/2, if you do the long division, is 0.5. Move the decimal to become a percent, and it becomes 50%. That's about 5. There we go. All right, let's move down. The shaded section of the circle graph represents, so this little corner right here. If you look at this circle and you cut it like that, this is 1 out of 4, and we can just ignore this piece. 1 out of 4, or the percent of 25%. Same thing we did above, 1/4 is 0.25 as a fraction. Move the decimal point, it becomes 25%. All right, let's look at the next one. So we're looking at this piece plus this piece. So it says the shaded section of the circle graph represents. See how this piece is a fourth? If I take this circle graph and I cut it, I have 1, 2, 3, and I'm going to ignore this line here, fourths that are shaded. 3/4 as a decimal would be 0.75, which is also 75%. All right, now this is where it starts to get a little bit tricky. And we're looking at this slice right here. We want to know how many percent that represents. So for this one, I recommend let's extend our circle graph lines. So do you see how the quarters are cut in half? So I'm going to cut this quarter in half here, and I extended this one down. So this is 1 out of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So that's 1/8. If you do the long division with 1/8, you get 0.125. Move the decimal 2 places over, you end up with 12.5 as the percent. Now, you could also look at this as a whole 25%, and I can see that it's cut in half. So I could do 25 divided by 2, and that will equal 12.5. So that's where that also can come from. So if you don't like to do the fraction, you could always just take 25 divided by 2, and that'll become your percent. And then the last one, we're talking about this piece here. So that's 2 of those 12.5s, or you can just look at it as the fourths. So you could do 2/8 or 1/4. Either one would be fine, but they both represent the 25%.
So continuing with this video, we are going to look at these circles, and we're going to determine how many pieces of each circle are represented to rate the fraction, and then we're going to turn that fraction into a percentage. So if I cut this, and I'm just following the lines of the circle so I can make all the pieces equal, because the yellow piece and the gray piece are not the same size as the red piece and the purple piece. So I need to make them all the same size in order for me to be able to compare them and write appropriate fractions and percentages. So if I look at the yellow piece is 1/8 of the circle. The red piece is 1, 2, 3, 4 of the 8 pieces of the circle. The pink piece, or the purple piece, is 2 of the 8 pieces of the circle. And the gray piece is 1 of the 8 pieces of the circle. Now, we did learn proportions, and so we're going to use proportions in order to turn these into percentages instead of turning them into decimals. Now, if you really wanted to turn it into a decimal by using long division, I'm not going to stop you. But a proportion is going to be a lot quicker. So the way you set up the proportion is you do 1/8 is equal to, well, we know a percent is always going to be out of 100. So I'm looking for some sort of percent out of 100. And you're going to cross multiply butterfly that, just like we've done in our proportions unit. So I'm going to start with x, and that's going to be 8 times x, which is 8x. And then I'm going to do 1 times 100, which will be 100. I end up dividing by 8 on both sides. That cancels. So I'm left with x is equal to 12.5%. And that's your percentage that represents 1/8 of the graph. Now you could memorize that if you want to memorize that 1/8 of the graph is 12.5%. That's perfectly fine too. If you memorize it, actually makes it a little bit easier. So if we look at the next one is 4/8. So we're going to do 4/8 versus a percent that we don't know over 100. Cross multiply. So I have 8 times x, which will be 8x. And if you need to slide in an extra sheet of paper for this, or if you need to show your work off to the side, or in this open space up top, that's perfectly fine. We kind of left you some little spaces, and I apologize for that. So we have 8x, and then if we do 4 times 100, we get 400. And then I have to divide by 8 on both sides to get x by itself, and I'm left with x is equal to 50%. Now, some of you may not have even needed to do the long division for that one. I'm sorry, the proportion. Because 4/8 is half. Half is 50%. So if you have 50% memorized, you really don't need to do the proportion. All right, let's look at the next one. So we have 2/8. We're going to write it as a proportion to solve it, to figure out the percentage. So I have x over 100 because the percent is out of 100. So that gives me 8x, because 8 times x, we don't know, is 200. Divide by 8 on both sides to get x by itself. So I'm left with x is equal to 25%. And an easy way you could remember that one, that's that L piece. Remember, when you have that L piece, that's automatically 25%. So I didn't even have to do the proportion if I can remember the trick. And then the last one that I have there is that 1/8. And we've already done that before, so I'm not even going to set up the proportion. If you really want to, it would be 1/8 equals x over 100, which we know from above is that 12.5%. All right, so let's look at number 2. And you can see this orange piece here is the smallest piece. That's actually going to be 1/8. So I need to cut the rest of my circle so I can figure out what sizes are the rest of the pieces in relation to that little orange piece. So yellow is 1, 2, 3, 4 of those 8ths. Orange is 1 of those 8ths. And that white is 3 of the 8ths. To cut down on our work a little bit, we've already done the proportion for 4/8. So we have 4/8 equals x over 100. Remember, you just cross multiply it. 8x is equal to 400. Divide by 4 or 8 on both sides, and we end up with 50% because it's half. 1/8 we've already done, which is 1 over 8 equals x over 100. And that comes out to be 8x is equal to 100. Divide by 8 on both sides. We've already did this one on the previous circle. So that's x equals 12.5%. And then the last one is 3/8. So I have 3/8 equals x over 100. And if I multiply that one, I get 8x is equal to 300. Divide by 8 on both sides to get x by itself. And I'm left with x equals 37.5%. And it's perfectly okay for them to be decimal percentages. No harm, no foul there. All right, so let's look at number 3 and number 4. Number 3 and number 4 is just looking at data and determining which circle graph matches it most appropriately. So in number 3, it says a survey of 100 families, 30 families preferred cheese pizza, 40 families preferred cheese pepperoni pizza, 20 preferred cheese mushroom, and 10 preferred deluxe. Circle which circle graph best represents the given data. So the easiest way to look at these is to look at the largest and then look at the smallest. So the largest piece, if I look, I have 30, 40, 20, and 10. The largest piece is going to be that cheese pepperoni. So I need to only look at the circle graphs and find cheese pepperoni. Well, is cheese pepperoni the biggest slice in this one? Nope, so it can't be the answer. Is cheese pepperoni the biggest tier? Yes. Is cheese pepperoni the biggest tier? Nope. Is cheese pepperoni the biggest tier? Nope. So I'm only left with this one. Double check yourself though. The smallest piece would be the deluxe, and deluxe is smallest here. So that's why this pizza pie circle graph would be the solution. Go ahead, read number 4. See if you can answer number 4 on your own. When you're ready, unpause the video and we'll check it together. So in this one, again, you're just going to look at your largest piece and then your smallest. So we had 50 families preferred Coke, 30 preferred Sprite, 20 preferred root beer, which circle graph represents the data. So I'm going to look for the biggest one, which is Coke. Well, Coke is biggest here. It is not biggest here, and it's also biggest on this one. Now I'm going to look at the smallest, and root beer is the smallest preferred. So root beer is smallest here, but root beer is not smallest in this one. So it should have been the second one there. Okay, last thing that we're going to look at in this video is we're going to talk about constructing circle graphs from just data that we're given and how to make our own. So when constructing circle graphs, it's important to remember to determine the total that is being used. And we need to write each piece of data as a fraction or as a ratio. And then we're going to... All right, just ratio, not n. And then we're going to turn each ratio into a percent, and we're going to use a proportion. We can also use the basic sections of the circle graph that we discussed, which would be 50, 25, 12.5, and 75 to cut it easily into pieces. So at Bayard Middle School, they did a survey of 200 students to see their favorite kinds of music. Complete the table and show the results in the survey in the circle graph. Make sure to include the title and the key. So the first question we have to ask ourselves before we can even get started is, what is the total? Well, we know the survey was of 200 students. And it says use the total as the denominator. That's the bottom number in the ratio. So if I look at my table, they're telling me how many people for country, jazz, rock and roll, and other. So I have 52 people for country, and that's 52 out of 100. Jazz would be 22, I'm sorry, not 100, 200, because our total is 200. 22 out of 200. Rock and roll is 100 out of 200. And other is 26 out of 200. So now we're going to turn those ratios or those fractions into percentages. And we need to remember that percents are always out of 100. So we can set each ratio equal to 100. And there's actually 2 ways to do this one. So if you look, I can easily go simplify from 200 to 100. If you don't like to do the simplification way, you can do the butterfly method. That's fine too. So I can either divide by 2 to divide 200 into 100, or I can do the butterfly method and do 200x is equal to 5,200, divide by 200 on both sides, and I get x is equal to 26%. Now, if you wanted to just do the simplification method, I'm going to change this to a denominator out of 100. I can take 200, divide it by 2 to make 100. Whatever I do the bottom, I have to do to the top as well. So 200 divided by 2 would be 11 out of 100, which makes 11%. Either one is perfectly okay with us. You can either do the proportion, or you can either simplify, but not all of them are always going to simplify nicely. So make sure that you're careful. This one just happens to. So I'm going to change this one to out of 100, divide by 2, divide by 2. 100 divided by 2 is 50. So 50 out of 100. Percents are always out of 100, so that's 50%. And then I'm going to change this one to out of 100. And I'm going to demonstrate the proportion here. It doesn't matter which one you use. I'm just showing you another way. So it'd be 200x is equal to 26,000, or 2,600, I'm sorry. Oh, too many zeros. I'm going to divide by 200 on both sides. Cancels here, so I'm left with x is equal to 13%. Now, the trickiest part of this whole thing is going to be actually creating your circle graph. Let's put our title, though, on our circle graph real quick. So this is, if we look at the problem, it says Byard Middle School did a survey of the students to see their favorite kinds of music. So this title is going to be Students. Oops. Wrong students. Favorite music. And of the students' favorite music, we're going to make our key. And from our key, we're going to label our different music choices. So we're going to have one pattern or color representing country. Then we have jazz. Then we have rock and roll. And then we have other. Now, we need to cut our circle graph into the pieces of the table. And I drew these dotted lines here for you so you kind of have some guidance. So the easiest one to cut is going to be this 50%. That's going to be half of the circle. So let's cut that. And that's going to be rock and roll. And that's 50%. Oops. And you can highlight that, you can color that. I'll color mine yellow if it'll let me. Nope, it won't let me. So I'm just going to have to write my numbers in. The program's not letting me highlight. Now, country I think is going to be the next easiest one because I can do that 50, 25, 75. Country's at 26. Do you really think you'll be able to tell the difference between 25 and 26 though? Probably not. So I'm just going to cut it into one of those perfect L pieces. So this is going to be country. That is 26%. And then now all that's left is to cut other and jazz. Other is 13%, whereas jazz is 11%. So other should be just slightly bigger than jazz, not by too much. I'm going to say this one's going to be other at 13%, and this one's going to be jazz at 11%. So really all I stuck to was that 50, 25, 75, and then the 12.5, which is half of 25. If you have any questions about how to cut the circle graphs, please make sure you check in with your teacher. The biggest skill that we want you to understand from this lesson is how to take the ratio and turn it into the percentage, whether you're simplifying or you're using the proportion.